Action is going to be talking to us, and she is going to give us a presentation on the suffragette movement in Oregon. And without further ado, I'm going to Jan.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Marlene. I'm really pleased to be invited to your meeting today. If you didn't know already, the League of Women Voters is a partner of the Century of Action Project, and we're very excited about that. We've been working with Marge Easley a bit, and I'm sure we'll do some other collaborating as we move towards the centennial year next year of 2012. So I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of Oregon suffrage history with kind of a focus on the successful 1912 campaign, which is when women in Oregon got the vote, and hence why it'll be the centennial of that wonderful event next year. And then I'll also talk just a little bit about the Centennial Project with you. So I think some of the questions that we started trying to answer as historians and archivists was, why was 1912 finally the year that Oregon women got the vote? They'd been working on that effort for 42 years. They'd had 5 unsuccessful votes before that, which is a record among all states that passed suffrage at the state level before the 19th Amendment. I suppose a dubious honor on our part. But finally, it did happen. And so I'm going to kind of walk us through that history. The opening slide here, nothing will settle it but victory, was a quote of Abigail Scott Dunaway's, who she was just saying, there's nothing really short of the full vote is really all we're going for here. But there's also 2 words up there that cause people some questions. And so I thought I would start with just some couple of brief definitions. One is woman. People often think we're being grammatically incorrect, but woman was really the term that was used in the 19th century and the early 20th century to really refer to kind of all womanhood, all women. So it really was a plural use back then, and we think that it applies when we're talking about that era. The other is suffrage, which is, if you go on YouTube ever at all, there's some funny plays on people trying to relieve people of their suffrage, equating it with suffering or something, but it's really, the Latin root is to vote. So it's a very apt word. And because it was such a symbol for women and ethnic minorities and racial minorities who were aspiring to be full citizens and saw the vote as a very positive tool for change and really kind of a mark of equality, that we think that it's a word that needs to come back in fashion, and so we use it regularly. I like to start with this image because I think one of the things that has become known over time is that it was really the Western states that took the lead on passing suffrage for women. Some of the territories did it very early, but this illustration, which was in Puck magazine, which was a humor magazine in the 19th century, shows this very romantic woman striding with her Votes for Women cape flowing out behind her, bringing the light and enlightenment of these Western states to the Eastern states that aren't quite so advanced out of the, I like to think of it as the primordial ooze yet, which was, you know, some people thought that was kind of contradictory to experience. Certainly the first Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, and all the national suffrage organizations were actually, you know, based back east, and that was where the largest amount of the population of the country was at that time. But the fact was that Western political parties and establishments weren't quite so rigid yet. They were a little more open to experimentation than the Eastern counterparts. And the fact that, you know, a lot of these people had come across, you know, the Oregon Trail. They had kind of a different spirit about them. Men and women worked in more equal situations, you know, settling in this new area. And that they deserved then, perhaps, some more equal rights than in other parts of the country. And so that's really kind of how it all began. Abigail Scott Dunaway may be a name that's familiar to some or all of you. She is certainly often referred to as the mother of Oregon suffrage, and perhaps even the pioneer woman suffragist of the entire Pacific Northwest. She was one of those people who came across the Oregon Trail, was through a variety of her life circumstances, married, had children, due to some economic downturns and injuries to her husband Ben, had to go to work herself and worked as a milliner, a teacher, and had been a lifelong writer. And at some point, as she got involved in the national kind of women's rights movement, she became a journalist, and she started her own newspaper, the New Northwest, which you can see her holding in this photo here, in 1871. And she used that publication as a platform for conveying national suffrage information and issues, writing editorials herself. There was a lot of poetry. It was really just a wonderful communication tool. And she was very connected in with the national movement. The same year that she started the New Northwest, she actually went to San Francisco and met Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were two of the initial folks, women at the Seneca Falls Convention. And Anthony really became Dunaway's mentor. She came back to Oregon with Dunaway, and the two of them toured all over Oregon, and Anthony then went up into Washington and even parts of Idaho, just speaking everywhere. And Anthony was quite an accomplished, powerful public speaker, and Dunaway really learned her craft in public speaking from her. And you see a handbill on the right announcing a lecture. And Dunaway was really quite a tireless lecturer. There's evidence and dates and things that show that she gave about probably 200 lectures one year during the height of her travels. As much as Abigail Scott Dunaway was connected in with this national movement, she was definitely a very opinionated person and often had clashes with the national movement. The temperance movement and the suffrage movement were very much entwined, and Dunaway was not a proponent of temperance. She thought that it was going to be a real hindrance to getting men to vote for women, because we do always have to remember it was the men who had the vote, the men who had to be convinced to extend the franchise to women. It wasn't women voting this right for themselves. And so, Dunaway, and there were interesting dynamics that played into the Oregon and the national suffrage movement. But they did work together. And in 1905, the Oregon suffragists realized that the Lewis and Clark Exposition was going to happen. It was going to be this huge event. It was like a World's Fair that happened in the summer in Portland, and that there were going to be a lot of national attention. There was going to be a lot of people coming to Oregon for this event, and they convinced the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, to hold their annual convention in Portland that summer and kind of reap the benefit of all that attention. And it was hugely successful. They had a lot of people out here. This is a photograph of many of the attendees at the conference standing in front of the Oregon building on the site of the Lewis and Clark Exposition. The Oregon women's clubs and other women's groups had raised money for a statue of Sacagawea, the Indian woman the Sioux woman who came across with Lewis and Clark, and they had this wonderful sculpture that was resided on the grounds during the fair, and now actually resides in Washington Park. It still exists. And Susan B. Anthony came out. This is her right in the middle. She was 85 at the time and would not live a lot longer after that. Abigail Scott Dunaway is standing right next to her, and the president of NAWSA at the time and for many years, Anna Howard Shaw, is on Dunaway's left there. And all of these women were powerful speakers. They gave wonderful orations and lectures some of them at the First Congregational Church in downtown Portland, Oregon, and they achieved their goal. There was a lot of local and state and national attention paid, and they used it to launch a campaign in 1906 that they hoped would be the final push that would get Oregon into the pro-suffrage column. They suffered a bitter defeat that year. Dunaway had a certain style of campaigning that she liked, which she called the still hunt. And what that meant was she liked to kind of lobby the legislators and the powerful business people in the state behind the scenes. She didn't want a big public splash. She thought that would rile up too much opposition. And so that had always been her approach. The national movement, including Anna Howard Shaw and some of the younger suffragists who got involved in the 1906 campaign, like Esther Lovejoy and Sarah Evans, who I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, very much wanted to do that public type of campaign as well. And so there was this friction that was going on. There was also an interesting dynamic between Abigail Scott Dunaway, who ran very obviously pro-suffrage editorials and articles in her paper, The New Northwest, and her brother Harvey Scott, who was the very powerful and longtime editor of The Oregonian. And he was on the other side of that issue and ran decidedly anti-suffrage editorials in his newspaper, The Oregonian. And so between all of these combinations, the suffrage issue did not pass, but it kind of engaged all these younger women and really moved the Oregon campaign to another level. And I mentioned that there was organized anti-suffrage campaigns, and that's very true in Oregon as well as the nation. There were really kind of two strategies. One was go and try and get a national amendment all at once, and another view was to try and do it at the state level. And the state level seemed to be working in the late 19th and early 20th century. This happens to be a picture of an anti-suffrage storefront in New York, but there were ones like this around the nation. And a mainstay of their arguments were that women were morally superior to men, and they would be debased by engaging in the crass world of politics, and that one of my favorite quotes is that by participating in politics, women would be rendered hard, harsh, unlovable, and repulsive. So, you know, make your choice, ladies, because this is what's in store for you in the future. And they also feared that it would distract from women's domestic and family duties, that they would spend way too much time worrying about, you know, who they would vote for. On the other hand, they were saying they couldn't be responsible enough, so there was this interesting tug and pull going on. And there was some concern that women would unite and vote as a bloc and might outvote the men all the time, and that was a frightening proposition. And that men just liked having all the power and all the say, and so they were going to resist giving that up. And they used, you know, mass media kind of techniques of advertising as well to get their point across. This little pamphlet on the right is actually from an Oregon campaign. We're not sure exactly which year, but clearly it's doing a very interesting visual, you know, I don't want any skirts making the decision about who runs my government. I did mention Esther Lovejoy before, and this is her down in the right-hand corner. She had earned her medical degree at what is now OHSU. It was then University of Oregon Medical School. She had been going about setting up her practice, and there were a lot of kind of professional women who were realizing how hard it was to pursue their professional dreams and desires without the rights that, you know, of voting and many other rights that women were clamoring for at that time. And Esther Pole Lovejoy had a mentor in Anna Howard Shaw, who was also a medical doctor. So like Anthony had mentored Dunaway, Shaw had mentored Lovejoy. She had been very active in the '06 campaign, was put off by Dunaway's style, and had, for a variety of reasons, not been real active in the 1908 and 1910 campaigns. But by 1912, she was really ready to go and said, you know, this is our time. She was very interested in doing a very public campaign, so completely the opposite of Dunaway. And because Dunaway was 77 at the time, she actually was ill much of 1912. She was not physically present, and so this younger crowd just kind of saw the moment and seized it. And so Esther Pole Lovejoy, Sarah Evans, Elizabeth Eggert, and Grace Watt Ross were 4 women who were involved in either the Portland Women's Club or another women's club, and that they had suffrage committees, and they were really some of the driving force. They also did get some financial and other types of support from NASA that year, and Lovejoy was very front and center. And one of the things that they really wanted to do was really bring as many groups and as many people under the tent as they could. They had seen that be successful in other states. Washington passed suffrage for women in 1910, California the following year in 1911, and they had seen these kind of tactics work where they built a lot of coalitions with other women's groups, men's groups, labor, the Grange. It really was amazing to see how many groups. There were 23 groups in Portland alone, and some of those were neighborhood groups. There was just a whole wide variety. There were 57 groups around the suffrage groups around the state. So it really was genuinely a statewide campaign. And people traveled all over the state and came to Portland as well. Another one of our favorites is William Pike Davis. You see him in the bowler hat up here on the front of the truck. And he was a lawyer. He had actually served as legal counsel for several suffrage groups. And he had been an advocate of suffrage, but during 1912, he sort of had been a famous bachelor. And during 1912, he actually married a widow who had 4 girls. And people kidded him that that was kind of why he got behind this campaign, but he said, no, 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 he'd been a believer long before that. But he organized the Multnomah County Men's Equal Suffrage League and then proceeded to organize similar ones around the state. So he was really kind of out there walking the talk there. And he was just an interesting guy. One of the things that they did together is captured in this wonderful photo that's held in a private collection by Amy Kadori. And that's actually Esther Pole Lovejoy holding the Votes for Women umbrella. And this was the Ballyhoo lunch wagon that they outfitted, and it rolled around the city of Portland during the Rose Festival. And that year, for a variety of reasons, the Rose Festival was 3 weeks long. And so at this lunch wagon, they carried around cold drinks and ice cream and sandwiches, which they dispensed for free, along with really good reasons why women should have the vote. It was hugely successful. And Esther was just kind of a real master at this. One of the things that she also did that year in trying to engage wage-earning women was starting an organization called the Everybody's Equal Suffrage League. And I'm not sure the origins of her idea, but membership was 25 cents. It got you a lifetime membership, and anyone who joined was a vice president. So there were all these women who were completely taken by that, and they joined up, and it was great publicity, and at some point it was reported there were 600 members. So these were, you know, really interesting, intriguing ways that they engaged people. And Lovejoy was definitely front and center in all this, and she did an interview in the Woman's Progressive Weekly after the successful campaign, and here's how she describes it. It was preeminently a campaign of young women impatient of leadership, and they worked just about as they liked, and that's how they planned to vote. There was certainly neither head nor tail to the campaign. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about reading their words from that time is you just get a sense of kind of how exciting it was and how they were engaged and how this was just all coming together. And there were limited but significant outreach and bridges made to different racial and ethnic groups during this campaign that had not happened previously. In the right-hand corner is a photograph from a luncheon of the Chinese American Equal Suffrage Society with a couple of women suffragists. Dr. Chan is in the dark suit. She's a little hard to see there in the front row. Perhaps a colleague of Lovejoy's, we're not quite sure. But China had become a republic in 1911. There was a lot of discussion on the West Coast about the fact that Chinese women might have the right to vote, and shouldn't they have the right to vote in Oregon also was one of the arguments that was made. Hattie Redmond is up in the upper corner there. She was the president of the Colored Women's Equal Suffrage Association, and we don't know a lot about her, but you know, she shows up in several press releases that were talking about different suffrage organizations around the state. And this is a little announcement that you can see. Lovejoy went to speak on behalf, or you know, as a speaker for the Colored Women's Equal Suffrage Association at one of the predominantly black churches in Portland, the Mount Olivet Baptist Church. And this is a wonderful ad that was printed in the Italian language newspaper, La Tribuna Italiana, right before the election in November 1912, that's saying basically votes for women, 10 reasons why. So really everybody was kind of coming at this in the best way that they could, and using all kinds of interesting kind of mass media techniques. A lot of people consider this sort of the beginning of the consumer culture, this period of time. This wonderful cartoon that you see on the left here, "It is not good that man should be alone," was published in papers around the state, sometimes shown on movie screens in theaters around the state before the main feature started. And it's very visually engaging. It's showing this rather forlorn-looking single guy standing in Oregon, and he's surrounded by all these very happy couples where women have the vote. And that was another argument that was used in 1912. You know, come on, all our neighbors have the vote. You know, this is a local issue for us. You know, they're not better than us. Cars were still kind of new at this point, but they had what they called flying squadrons, where they would get in cars and drive out to distant parts of Multnomah and Clackamas counties, perhaps right around here. And they would put up handbills in storefronts and on columns, and I don't think they had staplers back then, but you know, the equivalent of hanging handbills wherever they could find it. You might notice in the right-hand corner there, it's at the bottom, it's talking about vote 300X, yes. It was amendment number 1, so the women's suffrage question was actually the very first item on the list of amendments that and initiatives that people had to vote on, and that's never a bad thing to be that first one on the list. And so finally on November 5th, I'm getting ahead of myself. I mentioned that it was a statewide campaign, and this is just one of my favorite photographs that has been recently either donated or discovered at the Deschutes County Historical Society in Bend. And it's taken on the porch of the Alexander and Florence Drake home. The Drakes were an important family in the founding of Bend. If any of you have been over to Drake Park, that's the same Drake family. And so there was a national speaker, Sarah Ergott, who's right here in the white shirt sitting, came to speak. This is probably in May of 1912. There's evidence that she was there then. And I think one of the things that it helps point out is that there was a lot of sharing of materials and ideas, not only from the national to the states, but between the states. And this poster, which I've highlighted here, is being held by a woman on the porch, was actually an award-winning poster that was designed for the California suffrage campaign the year before in 1911. So clearly she had been there, or they'd sent some posters to share this very evocative image that they had used successfully in their campaign. And this other woman who's sitting, it's way too small to read, but her little placard says, "Why should women get the vote? Why not?" We'd love to find one of those. If anybody's ever seen one of these in your attic or someone's basement, please let us know. We're dying to have one in person. But finally, on November 5th, it was successful. It was a close vote. It was 61,265 men in Oregon said yes, women should have the vote, and 57,104 said no. So it was 52%. It was a bit of a squeaker election, but it was finally accomplished. Everyone could heave a big sigh of relief, despite years of kind of wrangling. The National and many other groups and people singled out Abigail Scott Dunaway in their telegrams. This is one of my favorite that came from the National Suffrage Association that says, "Congratulations of the triumph of justice, long live Oregon men." And because Dunaway had been so central to this 42-year battle, Governor Oswald West, who you see there, and Abigail Scott asked Dunaway to write out the equal suffrage proclamation, which she did by hand, and they're doing a ceremonial signing on the porch of her friend and fellow suffragist Viola Coe there. And this is her original voter registration card. And Dunaway was the first woman to vote in Oregon in 1913. And both the card and the original proclamation are still held in the state archives. They've been on display before, and they'll be on display again in 2012, and I'll actually talk in a second about where you can access them online. And so what the vote in 1912 did was remove the word male from the description of who had voting privileges in Oregon from the state constitution. And while it gave votes to most women, there were still a few groups that didn't get the vote in 1912. Native American women needed to be married to a white man, or they could not, and they weren't really US citizens otherwise. And so as a non-citizen, you didn't have the right to the ballot, and that didn't change until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 for women and men who had immigrated here from Asia, so Japanese and Chinese and Southeast Asian. They were not allowed to become naturalized citizens, so they couldn't vote again until the 1920s. But it was still a huge stride and a huge accomplishment. Oregon was really one of the last states that passed suffrage at the state level. Thank you. And there were several Oregon suffragists, including Lovejoy, who worked to pass the 19th Amendment. That sort of became the next big goal. And there were several ways that happened. The National Women's Party, which was yet another wave of young suffragists on the national level who kind of broke off from NASA, and they were into, direct action. Let's do parades, let's go picket in front of the White House. They were pretty fearless. The picketing in front of the White House was very controversial, and when they continued to picket during the First World War, many of them were, they were often had things thrown at them. They were certainly looked down upon. They were often arrested, jailed. There's a whole story of force feeding and all of that I don't have time to go into. But there were a couple of Oregon women, including Clara Wold, who went and did some of that demonstration with the NWP. They also sent representatives out to the Pendleton Roundup, which you see up there. That's actually a car in 1915 that had some local reps from Oregon and Washington, and their banner on the side says, "We demand an amendment to the U.S. Constitution enfranchising women." And so I'd love to know what the reception was at the Pendleton Roundup and parts thereabout. And either women from the states or representatives from the, representing the states that had women's suffrage were often used as models, kind of put out in front at parades. And you can see kind of one representation of that here, very romantic kind of images. But it was used as a great tool to say, look, it works. You know, these states have given women the vote. Democracy continues. It can happen everywhere. And of course, then there was finally, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified on August 26, 1920. And the image in the right-hand corner is of that moment of victory of Alice Paul, who was one of the founders of the National Women's Party, unveiling the suffrage flag, which they had been meticulously stitching a new star every time a state had ratified. And Oregon was one of the early states that ratified as well. And so that's my quick run through Oregon suffrage history. But I thought I'd talk just a little about the Century of Action and the centennial plans that we've got going. We're certainly, I think our goals are to help people get educated and aware and knowledgeable about this history and these people. And if possible, to figure out ways to incorporate the centennial and stories of the suffrage in your own organization, which I know the League just kind of does by who you are. You clearly started when the suffrage amendment passed. NASA morphed into the League of Women Voters. And so one of the ways that we have put a lot of our energy and resources is into a website, the Century of Action website. I don't think you can see the URL, but I've got some handouts that have it on it. Partly we were trying to figure out a way we could disseminate information statewide. And so every month, a scholar from Western Oregon University, Kim Jensen, posts a wonderful new item about something that was happening that month. And she's been doing that for a while. There's an archive on the site, and she'll do that through 2012. There's news and events, but there's also just great information here. We've got probably close to 200 news articles that you can click on. You can look at the article. They've actually been transcribed, so you can actually read them. But it really is a great education to hear what these people were saying, pro and con. And then Kim, again, did a wonderful project with her students at Western Oregon University just last winter, where they read all of these articles. They're the ones who transcribe them, so every time you read one, thank them for doing that. And then they wrote essays and kind of grouped them in categories. This is just a little smattering of them right here. There's some biographies and other essays on the site as well. And there's about 17 of those. So you really can just, there's a lot of information and great history there. We also worked with the Secretary of State to come up with an online exhibit. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Oregon Blue Book, which is really kind of the state's almanac that gets published every 2 years. And so for the 2011-2012 issue, we worked with the Secretary of State and the State Archives to do the color insert that's in the print books that are out now. The new edition is out, and I know you can order them online, and a lot of bookstores carry them. But we also did kind of an expanded suffrage exhibit online that you can also reach going to the Secretary of State's site. That's just got wonderful images and, again, some more essays and details and captions to them. And so I think with that, I will stop talking and entertain questions and thoughts. Yes, ma'am.
I do have a question, but also Abigail's niece is a sorority sister of mine, one of her nieces.
And I've met a couple of her.
Shirley is her first name.
Okay, I haven't met her. I've met a couple of her great-great-granddaughters. Still live in the Salem area, and Sancha actually came to, we had a fun event on March 8th in Salem that was kind of the kickoff of the website, and the students that Kim worked with were there, and Secretary Brown spoke, and former Governor Barbara Roberts was there and gave the kind of the keynote speech, and I did get to meet Sancha Dunaway there. And actually, I've met another relative who lives back in, is it Minnesota, I think, and she actually has a daughter named Abigail. It's very sweet.
Well, to continue, I also, I had both, I've taken, I have a document here that I wrote, but was the fact that she was a rather irascible person for, and I can't put my finger on my bibliography that I got this from, but it was about 9 years, I think, that she was the head, the head person, but she didn't have a very gentle manner. But interesting again, her husband, just like Harry Chapman Catt and Elizabeth Stanton, were really behind their wives. And I have a little story that when Ben told her, it's not going to be done unless somebody does it, and sent her on her way. But one of the things that I wondered, there was a lawyer, Blackstone, that really kind of messed with them, internationally. Have you ever run across his name to know if he came to Oregon or not?
I haven't, but I'll make a note of that and ask around a little with some people who've done, some other different research too, because that'd be interesting to know.
Yeah.
Blackstone.
Blackstone.
Okay. I'll look.
But I'm kind of in their time. I'm pretty old. So, but my dad was a newspaper man, so I kind of had an insight into what was going on between Abigail and her brother, and that was really pretty serious. But she tried to do a few little sneaky things there too.
Absolutely.
What kind of things did you say that are planned for the Century of Action? Is there any plans for things happening?
Well, people are kind of, a lot of different organizations are kind of devising some of their own ways to go about it. We're a very small group. We have a couple of things that we're doing. But then, like AAUW is another partner of ours, and different branches are taking on different projects. So one of them actually has started doing a writing contest about sort of what the history of suffrage means to you in the Salem area. We actually have put a lot of kind of our efforts into the website, really wanting to try and get the information out there, because I think it's not always easily accessible, and I think people, if they have access to the material, and read it and learn for themselves, that's important to us. We've also done a couple of sort of mock town hall debates that we put together using news articles and letters to the editor and speeches that were published during 1912, and formulated a sort of debate of the pro and anti-suffrage arguments. We performed it, sort of a group of us, and then we got a couple of guests to come do it. We did it once out at Cornelius Pass at the McMenamins out there. There's a wonderful old barn. We did that last July, and we're going to do that a couple of more times, and we'll have some information on the website about that. And then we did it in Astoria at the Oregon Heritage Commission. The commission's been a big supporter of ours, and a big grant from them actually helped fund building the website. And they have an annual dinner, and we got some local Astoria folks to join us and added a little Astoria flavor to it. And we're going to do another one in November of this year at the Multnomah County Downtown Library on November 5th, and we'll have some more details about that. So we're going to do that a few times. And then we've got a few things in the works, but nothing that I'm really at liberty to, aren't in the...
Can you say what the website's address is?
Sure. It's www.centuryofaction.org. And I'm going to give you some handouts here when I'm done that has all that on it too. But it's really a wonderful site, and I just can't say enough about Kim Jensen and her students, who really just did a wonderful job. And it was great to see them down in Salem, because they were kind of showing off their work, and they just learned a lot. And they provided a huge service to us by transcribing all of those. And It just really made material much more available to everybody, so it was a wonderful collaboration. Well, thank you all for having me. I could talk forever about all of these women and men, and I look forward to talking to you again. Thanks.
Thank you very much for coming and talking to us. And I think we have taken a lesson from you and from the suffragettes, and we have formed many, many coalitions on our own today. And I think it really works quite well. And we not only have learned from the past, but I'm sure we're going into the future.
Put it into action yourself.
Yes. And I know Kate Brown and the League and you and Amy, we're all working really hard to get the word out.